The music.
Yeah, I was telling Shantaro this morning when I came in about how much I was looking forward to hearing his music, because I've been here before and it just fills me with life and spirit. Thank you. And Bob, wow, that was amazing. Thank you. It was just beautiful. And it means so much to me today when I learned from Karen that you were going to be doing that Gregorian chanting. I thought, wow, it's one of those, I used to call them my God moments as an agnostic, when I think that there's a God because things are lining up so perfectly. Now I know that there is, not just this morning from that, but that's where I am in my spiritual journey. And the reason I say that is because there are beautiful things about Christianity. There are, when I was planning the service, when I first started talking about this to Sue Kelly months ago, I knew what I wanted to talk about, but she didn't know, and I didn't know, that it had anything to do with Christianity until just about a week ago. And so when I learned that you were chanting, I thought, this is beautiful, this is perfect. I was at a celebration of life yesterday for a good friend of mine's father, and when the preacher got up to begin preaching, this was at a United Church of Christ congregation in Detroit, he said, and this may sound familiar to some of you because I feel like I've heard something like this before, and maybe the word sermon was speech, but he said something like, and it just resonated with me when I was reflecting last night on my final, how I was putting this together. The sermon I was going to write, and then there's the sermon I wrote, and then there's the sermon I gave. And then I was reflecting on that and thinking, and ultimately, the sermon you heard is going to be something completely different, maybe. So I knew that this was going to follow after the election, and that regardless of whoever was elected president, we would have a lot of work to do, especially in deepening our relationships and communities. I have done quite a bit of get out the vote work in the last 9 years. It took me a long time to realize how important that work is. The process of democracy, as flawed as it is, also does give a voice to each of us who may not have another way to participate. Our ancestor, late Congressman and civil rights leader John Lewis, was known to call votes almost sacred because it allowed all God's children to have their voices heard in public life. Through this work and other organizing, I have learned a lot and built a lot of important, lasting relationships. In fact, it is because of those relationships that I think I have the sense of calm in this moment in time, while many others are feeling deep fear and hopelessness. So I thought it could be meaningful to spend the morning together sharing some of that work that I've done. And so I came up with the title, before I wrote the sermon, Spinning and Weaving a Stronger and Wider Web, Post-Election Relational Organizing. As my work and life have intertwined so much in the last 10 years, working for Moose Gen, I have had the opportunity to not only build personal relationships, but relationships with people around the state and country who are committed to the same justice issues as I am. Also, the older I get and the larger my field of reference grows, the more grateful I am for living in Detroit for the first 50 years of my life. It provided so many experiences I wouldn't have had other places, but especially over the last 25 years, being deeply rooted in Detroit activists, movement building, and healing spaces has been a treasure. What a blessing it has been to be held in beloved community. In fact, it's something I think about often as I hold gratitude. I also hold sadness that all people don't have and feel this sense of love and care. Firsthand, I have discovered how important intentional relationship building and deepening can be. It is rare to have people to trust, who trust you, where you can be transparent and be held accountable without being excluded. And it can feel okay, and even good, in fact. We are really going to be depending on each other much more into the future. Even if we don't consider the current political climate, environmental devastation due to climate change will cause us to learn to function in community in a way we have never known. How critical it will be to live in community. We won't be able to care for ourselves without each other. You will need to know who sews, cooks, teaches, gardens, heals, builds, repairs, and trust them to care, share, and barter with you. So I thought I'd come today and share some of my experiences and relational organizing tactics in history. I also thought I'd talk about peacemaking. Being in beloved community doesn't always feel good, and it's certainly not easy. So I thought I'd also share some experiences and tactics around that. But whew, I heard the sermon a few weeks ago here, "We need one another," given by Christy Cardinal, and they did such a beautiful job. And if you missed that service, watch it. I caught it online. And you might even want to watch it again if you were here. I took notes, and I want to listen again. They spoke of conflict in community, and that is okay and even necessary. They said, quote, "No one is disposable," and quote, "We must face our conflicts." They even asked, quote, "Do Trumpers belong in our beloved community?" And replied, quote, "Yes. Universal means universal." It reminded me of conversations I had in UU Sunday School about if universalists believe Hitler would go to heaven. And honestly, I still have a hard time with that question, especially in this day as we are seeing a genocide happen in Palestine and Gaza, and yet I am a universalist. They also mentioned Amber Marie's book, "We Will Not Cancel Them," which has been on my reading list since before its release. Christy Cardinal mentioned the book, and now I want to get it sooner than later. She also mentioned another book I want to check out, "Conflict is Not Abuse" by Sarah Schulman. And she talked about her community and belonging community as beloveds. So anybody that uses that language is somebody I want to pay attention to. My sister teaches in a neighboring town here. I'm sure most of you are much more familiar with this area than I am. My mother was born and raised in that town until she went away to Michigan State and never wanted to come back. She ended up in Detroit where she met my dad. We did visit my great Aunt Gertrude on her farmhouse in that same town as children. She lived in that same house that my mom spent time in as a child. In fact, great Aunt Gertrude was born in that house and actually died there too. She was I think 88. My grandpa's sister didn't see too much from that farmhouse. I think many of the families that live there today have lived there for generations and haven't seen much. Okay, back to my sister. She has taught in that district for a long time and developed a lot of relationships. And through those relationships of love and trust, she is able to have conversations and be heard in a way that moves me. She gets her students and some of their parents and some fellow faculty who have very different political leanings than her to listen and think critically in a way I think I never could. I haven't ever spent much time with, nor do I have relationships with a lot of people who don't agree with me morally on justice issues, partly because of the work I have chosen and people I spend time with. I'm so proud of her. But honestly, for many years, I have literally said to her and others, "I'm glad you're able to do that work, but I just can't." In fact, the last friend I was telling that to was sharing with me that since she has turned 50 a couple years ago, that now she is not dealing with other people's bullshit. She is just separating herself from it because she can't deal with the stress anymore. I was telling her how much I get it, and that I also have felt like that in the last few years. I'm 53. As I've been learning how to put on my oxygen mask first, and after decades of giving so much of myself away for what feels often like not much or even a minus in gain of any sort, but also she and I were talking a few days after the election as women, she being Palestinian and me being in relationship with a Black man and living in a racist suburb, and realizing us both damn it, there's still work to do. We can't just take the easy way out. I remember hearing Adrienne Marie Brown on a podcast saying that it was okay. We didn't have to spend time with people and get deeper with them if we didn't like them. She was particularly speaking about people who share our morals and common dreams, that we just need to have the same goal and either be in the same room sometimes or at least on the same page in different rooms. We have to work harder on difficult relationships and communication in communities we are already in. And we probably need to reach even farther and risk even more to get into different spaces, places we don't feel as comfortable. So then I thought I'd talk this morning about communities and neighbors, and how do we learn from the work my sister is doing, working in spaces where you work, live, and even shop, to begin to get to know people that you normally wouldn't see as your neighbor. And I thought I might speak on Mr. Rogers and remind us of the story of the Good Samaritan. And who is our neighbor? Probably not the person living next door. And speak on the importance of just smiling and saying hello. And I began jotting down some notes and feeling like I was on track for this sermon this morning. And then, last week, I was in my favorite bookstore in Detroit, Source Booksellers, in Cass Corridor on Cass Avenue. And the owner, Janet Jones, is somebody I've known. Her bookstore opened in 1989, the year I graduated from high school. And so I visited there frequently through the years. And she's an elder Black woman who has been a business owner for 30 years. I think she's a previous educator, and her daughter's an educator, and I love to go in there. I gain so much wisdom of things I look for and I'm not looking for every time that I'm with her. And so I was in the bookstore, and I was talking to her about I was going to be doing the sermon in a couple weeks, and I didn't know exactly where I was going. I had an idea, but I didn't know exactly where I was going. So she walked up as I was leaving, and she said, "Jen, remember you said you didn't know where you were going?" And she gave me a book. And it might be a book that you've read or heard of, and you may know the author, Jim Wallace. And his most recent book is, see if I can, The False White Gospel: Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. So, if you knew me well, if I was a member of your community, you would know I take direction from Black elders, especially Miss Janet Jones. She has gifted me with so much knowledge and love through the years. I went home with my new book and her instructions, and after thumbing through the book and listening to a couple podcasts, I decided she was right. This was an important part of this sermon. In fact, if I had read the whole book, it might have been the full sermon, or I might need to come back for that. Do you all know Jim Wallace? He's a well-respected Christian writer, leader, educator. He's the long-term editor of Sojourners magazine, which is really progressive Christian work. So the premise of the book is that white evangelical church members and followers are oblivious, stuck, confined, and captive to ideology and idolatry of white Christian nationalism. They have been lied to and kept from the truth, the good news, and they need to be set free. Jim Wallace states in his book, The False White Gospel, "I believe that central to the answer of why white evangelicals supported Trump even after seeing what he would do as a president is the core issue of race. A white ethnicity and patriarchal culture with the power to keep control is more important to many, or even most white evangelicals, than any gospel they allege to proclaim. Not about true Christian faith, but rather about race and power. Selective theology has always been about providing the justification for upholding racial and political power, from the doctrine of discovery and chattel slavery to the continuing evolution of white supremacy, America's original sin. White Christian nationalists, he says, are white first, Christian second. Right-wing Republicans first, Christians second. Wallace says white Christian nationalism is not about giving your life to Jesus or being a good disciple. This white Christian nationalism defies what Jesus says about loving our neighbor and even our enemies. It doesn't cross lines, it creates them. It certainly doesn't create peace. Jesus called the peacemakers the children of God. There is so much contradiction between the white evangelical Christian message and Jesus's message. And I'm starting to learn they don't even preach about Jesus in these evangelical churches. And when they do, they certainly aren't following his teachings and his examples. This isn't a completely new phenomenon. It's just grown like wildfires. Not wildflowers, wildfires. Frederick Douglass even said, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land." And you may be more familiar with the words from Mahatma Gandhi. "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." Christian pastors discussed with Jim Wallace the tension they feel between professional demands and their personal prophetic callings. Truth, risk, and cost are all issues for pastors. In fact, they're issues for all of us. The truth-telling we need now will indeed cost some pastors their jobs, pensions, and parsonages. This moment of moral crisis that calls for Christians to defend their faith by finally leaving behind the idea that some people should be valued more than others. There is actually opportunity here for church growth. As church institutions and leaders spread the truth, folks who are currently not joining churches or leaving church captivity may discover even us. If we are moving in an intentional way, they may even find us as a beloved, truth-telling community, moving us all towards collective liberation. They must be freed. We must help to free the captives. It wasn't surprising for me to read in Wallace's book that even many liberal white congregations have trouble with telling truth about race and American history, and that talking about it was increasingly met with aggressive pushback from many white congregations. I've seen this, particularly within our congregations when Black Lives of UU formed, especially when all congregations were asked to do a church service on a single day about white supremacy. We didn't like that. And the same thing is still in conversations around the eighth principle. Can human beings from different races, nations, classes, and gender backgrounds live together peaceably and share equal power in a democratic American future? Walls says what so many see and fear, quote, "the succumbing of the majority of a national political party, along with the faithless religious conformity of white evangelicals to a narcissistic and racist demagogue, has created the most threat to our democracy in American history. We are literally now in a battle between false religion and true faith, and between racist fascism and multicultural democracy. That fight stems from fear, the motivator of hate and the threat of violence. We are at a point of clear and present danger," says Wallace. And on the top of most of our heads as we move closer to 2025 is, will US democracy survive or collapse? Wallace calls it spiritual warfare. In August 2022, Biden said, quote, "As I stand here tonight, equality and democracy are under assault. We do ourselves no favors to pretend otherwise." He went on to say, "We are in the battle for the soul of our nation." So, what role will you take in this battle, in this revolution for our lives? And let's come back for a moment to relational organizing. If we are going to war, if we are going to survive the possibilities we fear, we're going to need each other. If we are going to turn things around, we're really going to need each other. So we better come back to building and deepening relationships and why that is the most important work right now. Besides Adrienne Marie Brown's new book, I recommend her podcast, How to Survive the End of the World, and her book, Emergent Strategy. She compares our organizing and emergent strategy to birds and trees and mushrooms. I wore my shirt today. I noticed your minister did that a few weeks ago. He said, keep theocracy out of our democracy. She compares our organizing to mycelium, underground, that which connects all the stuff. Emergent strategy is a concept she defines as how we intentionally change in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated worlds we long for. It is a set of principles and elements that continually turn us towards life in the midst of violence and devastation. Let's do mycelial organizing, inspired by the underground fungal networks that turn waste and toxicity into new life. Jesus said peacemakers are the children of God, not the peacekeepers, and certainly not the conflict starters. In this moment, if you are frozen by fear or feel so defeated, Christy Cardinal gave such important words around self-care and also risk. They said, it's okay to sit in your feelings, but when someone asks, do it. Put someone's safety over your discomfort. I couldn't agree more. I just want to add to that sentiment, and I'm certain they would agree. Don't wait too long for someone to ask. Do your research, organize with your friends, check in with those most vulnerable and impacted. I think it's time our churches act like we're woke. And using that word could take this in a whole different direction for me, but that's for another sermon. Today I use it as Jim Wallace does in his book. The right has tried to turn the meaning of woke to be so negative, which is so crazy, right? Because if being woke is being awake, seeing the light, then it certainly isn't a bad thing. And if somebody wants you to believe it is, don't you wonder why they want to keep you asleep in the dark? Don't you want to question what they are trying to hide? Maybe it's time for us to wake up. And the funny thing is, most of us think we belong to woke churches and with other woke people like us. So let's challenge ourselves to not just wake up, but to wake up and spread the word, the good news, the truth. We must free the captives. The truth will set them free. We must proselytize. John Lewis would call this good trouble. Growing up UU and serving as director of religious ed, I learned that UUs don't proselytize. I still only kind of understand, with so many people who find refuge here in UU congregations who are trying to get away from the proselytizing of their former faith. But why keep us a secret? Also, so many people come to UU congregations and say, I never heard of UU. I wish I did a long time ago. We have so much good news to spread, and not only do people want it, they need it. UUs don't like the word proselytize any more than prophet or evangelical. They are all very similar and not bad words at all. It's just how they have been misused and abused. We think of the word evangelical and we think of fundamentalist and orthodox and Bible thumping. But also in part of the definition of the dictionary, zealous in advocating for something. She was evangelical about organic farming. Growing up UU, I also learned about Jesus. There are a lot of good stories in the Bible. My favorite are the ones about Jesus and his parables. I can see why people use him as an example to live their life. I remember my mom saying that if Christians would focus on Jesus' life and not his death and call themselves Jesusans instead of Christians, she might have been a Jesusan. If God is love, then I see why Muslims and Christians consider Jesus a prophet. I also believe we can all be prophets. In the definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it includes an effective or leading spokesman for a cause, doctrine, or group. That makes me a prophet, right? Makes you a prophet, right? Could be. I don't know enough about how you are in the world. Preach the good news of democracy, said Reverend Rudra a couple months ago during the service when he had his t-shirt on. Yes, please, I say, tell folks about democracy. Tell folks about UUism. In Christianity, Jesus is the good news. Is it ridiculous to suggest that UUs could also spread the good news of Jesus? Can we preach the truth and set the captives free? Whether this country stands up to fear, hate, and violence will indeed be up to all of us. It's not everyone's work, but a piece of it is. And that piece may be different for each of us, or more than likely will change over time. We can step up and step back from doing the work of being neighborly. And although we need to each be prepared to be a martyr for justice, we may not need to put our physical life on the line, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer did, when as a young pastor he led the Confessing Church movement in opposition to Nazism in Germany during the 1930s. But hopefully, some of us will be willing to do that, and we all need to be prepared to give up something. While growing up at First UU, I learned of Alice Hertz. Her daughter Helga was a member of our church at the time. On March 16, 1965, Alice Hertz, an 82-year-old German Jewish immigrant, writer, and lifelong peace activist, set herself on fire on a street corner in Detroit to protest the arms race all over the world. Alice was the first U.S. activist to self-immolate in objection to the Vietnam War. In the Bible, John 12:23 through 25, as Jesus prepared for his death, he taught his disciples one of the greatest kingdom paradoxes, using his own life as an example. Jesus told them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains by itself. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. The one who loves his life will lose it, and the one who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life." So in closing, I think I've figured out what my sermon will be about. And I hope as you were listening to the process of my sermon writing weaving, it opened up some space for you to consider what your next moves will be. With the skills and connections you already have, how can you go deeper? What risks are you willing to take to build community with the larger goal of saving our democracy and people's lives? Will you work on dealing with a close or even internal conflict so you will be better prepared to do other work? Will you reach out to a neighbor or family member and have a difficult post-election call? If they are Christian, maybe even spread the good news about Jesus, the truth about Christianity. Will you help to set some folks free? What will you read? What will you sing? And will you move like mycelium? At the end of the day, Jim Wallace asks his students this question: I want to know if you're going to stay in this conversation after class. Thank you.